Welcome back into this special edition of the Fast Lane. Trey Lyle here with you, joined once again talking to Greg Barnes from Inside Carolina. Greg, let's jump right into this. You obviously previewed Virginia Tech, UVA, and now the oldest rivalry in the South, as they like to say, UNC Carolina once again. And this has been an opponent for both Mack Brown and North Carolina that they've struggled against lately, lost 4 straight. And this is I don't want to say a must-win game, but if Carolina wants to win the Coastal, it is a must-win game.
Yeah, it's certainly approaching that category, right? You really cannot start off 0-2 against Coastal Division foes, especially against teams that have every intention of winning the Coastal as well. That would just be a significant hill to climb for North Carolina. So I'm not really big into the must-win idea. However, to your point, if Carolina wants to get back in this thing and have a chance to play in Charlotte for the ACC title, this is one they really need. Otherwise, they've got a lot of work to do, and they're going to need a lot of help to get that done.
And obviously, a decent bounce back against Georgia Southern, and Virginia has looked really good this year, granted against William & Mary and maybe the second worst team, I should say, because they did beat Nebraska, Illinois in the Big Ten. So, but the struggles are still there. I mean, when your quarterback is your leading rusher, granted, Virginia has not run the ball well. So I think the first key of this game is who's going to control the line of scrimmage and who's going to have the best run game, and especially for Carolina, who struggled in the first 2 games this season.
Yeah, who would have thought, right? The fact that North Carolina had all 5 starters back on the offensive line. Virginia's kind of in the same boat. I think everybody that follows both schools thought, well, there may be some questions at other places, but you got to feel good about the offensive line. You got to feel good about the quarterback. And while both quarterbacks have looked pretty good, the offensive lines, not necessarily what we thought, especially with regard to the run game. And so for Carolina especially, there's just been way too many miscommunications. And the fact that Brian Anderson starting center, missed most of training camp. He didn't play against Virginia Tech. And Joshua Zdu, who's the best offensive lineman, he didn't play against Georgia State. That's part of it. But this group has played together for 3 years. And so the fact that there's not guys behind them that were capable of stepping up and filling those spots without much of a drop-off, I think is a little bit troubling. And beyond that, even with Georgia State, I mean, there were some real struggles. North Carolina's running backs gained 22 yards on 10 carries in the first half. And to your point, if Sam Howell's not the lead rusher for North Carolina, that game may have been a lot closer than what it ultimately became. So that certainly is an area where North Carolina has to do a much better job. And, of course, it's going to be a little bit tougher on Saturday.
Obviously, it's a little skewed given his sack yardage, and he broke 1 big run out in that game for a touchdown that kind of adds to the fact why he might be the leading rusher right now. But going to the other side of the ball, very similar to the last time we talked with Virginia Tech. I mean, you could argue Brennan Armstrong's looked like the best quarterback in the ACC. I don't know if I'd put him to that level, but he's looked impressive this year. 744 yards, 7 touchdowns. And the big thing is that struggled with him last season. He's turned the ball over only 1 interception. So he's looked really good. He's very dynamic, and it's going to be an issue for this Carolina defense.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just kind of looking at some of the Pro Football Focus stats. I think Brennan Armstrong has been pressured 13 times this year in 2 games. And you have to take into account the opponent for sure. But that's been an area where North Carolina has really struggled. And the thing about Brennan is in all the opportunities where he was not pressured, he was elite. And I think his grade was up around 95. And if you're hitting on passes like that and being that efficient, that's going to be troublesome for a lot of defenses. And North Carolina made an emphasis of doing a better job rushing the passer this offseason. We really haven't seen it the first 2 games. Now, granted, they weren't too concerned with Burmeister or Brown from Georgia State with their ability to throw the ball down the field. So then they were more concerned with contain. But Mack Brown's talked about this week that still remains a concern for this team getting after the passer. And so I think for North Carolina to be able to limit what Virginia has shown thus far passing, they've got to get some pressure on Armstrong. And if they don't, it's going to be a long day.
The versatility of Virginia's offense, they obviously have Keaton Thompson, who's kind of a Taysom Hill wildcat. He's played multiple positions this year. How unique of a challenge is that for a front for North Carolina? I don't want to that has not looked to the level that we thought going into the season?
I think it's a big challenge, and especially when you talk about a guy like Woods, who's just kind of such a threat over the middle, big and athletic as he is. You really have to decide what you want to do. And Jay Bateman really likes the cover one looks. He likes to play man as much as he can on wide receivers. And so when you add a guy in like Thompson, who, as you said, you can do a lot of different things, and will be on the field at the same time as Armstrong, and Armstead's kind of the same way. It adds a lot of challenges. And so what North Carolina is really focused on this week is saying, look, we know there's going to be a lot of eye candy out there. And that's something that Bronco likes to do, is try to confuse and confound defensive coordinators as best he can. But they really have to make sure they do a good job with gap integrity. They've got to do a better job with their angles and tackling. If they can handle all those things, they should be okay. But if they get out of position and they're trying to read things that aren't there, that's when things kind of get haywire. And I think Virginia had success doing that last year in this game.
Obviously, it was still such a big blow for this team given the expectations. And you kind of touched on it when we talked about the Virginia Tech game. Like, Carolina's gotten all the way there, but when they get to that next step, they kind of fall off. And it could really affect a team's season. And this is kind of, Georgia Southern is Georgia Southern, and you're going to win that game probably given the amount of talent. You can out-talent them. But in terms of just a quality opponent against a team they have not beaten, the best Carolina team last year lost to this UVA team in kind of a weird kind of game. What do you see as, like, is this kind of I don't want to say the breaking point of their season, but we talked about the must win, but like for this team with all this expectations, this feels like this could really just derail the season if they lose this game.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about this is if you look at what comes next, they've got Georgia Tech, who lost to Northern Illinois in the opener. They've got Duke, who lost to Charlotte in their opener. And then they got Florida State. I think everybody saw what happened against Jacksonville State last weekend. So probably, I think you could say that the three worst teams in the ACC. And North Carolina, it'll be a problem. So you've got a month here where the only opportunity North Carolina has to really say, hey, you know what? Virginia Tech was a bad game, but we're still this, top 15 type team, is Saturday night. Because if you lose to Virginia, you've got to wait an entire month until Miami comes to town on October 16th to be able to make some kind of claim that, okay, we've bounced back. So I think it's a critically important game for North Carolina, even confidence wise. It's one thing for us to be able to talk about them, but to themselves, like they feel the same way about Georgia Tech and Duke and Florida State. But if they don't have like a legitimate win until we get into mid-October, what are they thinking about themselves? So this is a very important game, not just for their hype and expectation, but for really what's going on in that locker room to feel like, okay, we're fine. We're as good as we thought. We just need to make sure we get better in all these different areas.
Sam's going to be Sam, and I mean that by, like, we know what we're going to get from Sam Howell. He's still, despite, if his worst game of his career is against Virginia Tech in the opener, like, there was a lot of factors going into that game. Like, first game back in Lane Stadium against what appears to be a really good defense with a really good secondary and a really good front that is played really well this season is obviously the strength for the Hokies. Who do you need to see step up? Obviously, the running backs have been an issue, and obviously, Bo Corrales not being there at wide receiver has been an issue. But who do you want to see from the skills position that kind of makes it seem as if this offense is similar to what it was last year? Obviously, talent-wise, it's not going to meet last year. There's guys playing on Sundays on that team last year, but who do you want to see from just step up and be able to, from a skill position in this game, that can kind of give us, or fans, I should say, kind of a sense of, okay, this is where this team's going. They finally have figured it out from what they lost last year.
I think there's a long list, to be honest with you. I think two guys who were really shut down last against Virginia Tech was Antoine Green and Emory Simmons. Josh Downs at slot receiver, he's proven that he's really good and that he can get open. But he was the only guy that really stepped up for UNC in that VT game. Antoine Green and Emory Simmons were not able to get separation. They did a better job against Georgia State, but again, it's Georgia State. So one of those two guys really need to be able to prove that, hey, against a legitimate Power 5 defense, we can create separation and give Sam Howell more options than just Josh Downs. And then Ty Chandler's playing a lot because he has experience. He's played a lot of big games at Tennessee. He's pretty good in pass pro. But he's struggled a little bit at kind of adapting to what Phil Longo wants to do, especially with the RPO game. So I think he needs to have a big game at some point. He played well in stretches against Georgia State, but really hadn't played up to what we thought he could do. So I think it's important for those two receivers and Ty Chandler to have a really big game against Virginia. And that's going to be critically important if North Carolina hopes to win.
And obviously, you play Georgia State, the defense should look good against an opponent like that. But I would argue the Virginia Tech kind of shot themselves in the foot more in that game against Carolina offensively. They were able to dominate the line pretty much throughout and control that game. What do you want to see from the defense that has not looked I'm not saying it was supposed to be the strength of this team, but what do you want to see from the defense in this game? Kind of, we talked about containing Brennan Armstrong and the versatility of Virginia, but what do you need to see from the defense in order to kind of reset what we think of this Carolina team from a team we don't really know about at this point?
Well, they really haven't been tested in the passing game. With Burmeister and Brown both being kind of running quarterbacks more so than anything. That hasn't been a really big concern. They were more concerned with kind of holding their position on the line. So I think we need to see exactly how this revamped secondary is going to play. We know the cornerbacks are good, but Jacarius Conley is only going to be playing in his third game, starting at safety. Trey Morrison's back there. He's played a lot. Don Chapman's in his third game at nickel. And so I think that's the key part is how they do against the pass. And then, of course, the counter to that is the fact that you've got to be able to get pressure on Armstrong, like we talked about earlier. If Armstrong's able to sit back there for 4 or 5 seconds and look down the field, it really doesn't matter how good your secondary is. He's, with what he's shown thus far of how much he's improved with his accuracy, he can pick a secondary apart if he's given time. So Carolina has to do a really good job of not just getting pressure with bringing blitzes. Anybody can do that. You've got to be able to get pressure when you're only sending 4 guys. North Carolina has not done that in the last 2 years, and that really needs to change starting on Saturday.
How important is and this is not like we talked about the coastal implications, but this is a team that's been a thorn in the side of this team, both during Mac Brown's era before he came back, and even now. This is 4 straight losses. Like, how important is it just to beat Virginia? Like, plain and simple, in a vacuum.
Yeah, anytime you get into a situation where a team kind of has your number, which Virginia clearly does with North Carolina, that kind of gets up in your craw a little bit, to use a Southern term, and it's a problem. And not only does that give Virginia a lot of confidence, saying, "Hey, we beat these guys 4 years in a row. There's no reason we can't do it again." But the opposite is true for North Carolina. It's like, God, we've had some close games. We've had opportunities to win the games. We just hadn't been able to get it done. And so there's a lot of guys on this team who have never beaten Virginia. Well, everybody on the team. There's a lot of guys who are like seniors who have played in multiple games against the Cavaliers and have not won. And so that's something they would like to do. And again, if you want to win the Coastal Division and you want to play for the ACC Championship, you have to take care of business in division play, especially at home. And so there's a lot of different things that come into this. But yeah, you never want to see a winning streak by an opponent, especially a divisional opponent. And then when you add in the whole South Oldest rivalry deal, that adds another component to it. So it's a big game for North Carolina to kind of shed some of that.
And looking, from the guys out west in Vegas, 10.5, kind of hovering around 10. The line's dropped all the way to 9. That's a big line for Carolina, given I think the experts don't have trust UVA yet, given their opponent. A lot of points, though, 66.5. The over would have hit last year with its 44-41 score. What do you think? Do you think this is going to be a closer game than most the so-called experts think, or do you think Carolina would be able to dominate?
Yeah, if I was a betting man, I would jump all over the points there. That seems like a massive line for this game. I know it's in Chapel Hill, but Mac Brown said it earlier this week. If you look just at what these two teams have done to start the season, Carolina won big against Georgia State. They didn't look good in the first half. And then we know how they looked against Virginia Tech. And yes, Virginia really hadn't played anybody, but they've taken care of business, and they did everything that they were expected to do in those 2 games. And the fact that Armstrong looks so much better just in terms of his accuracy and throwing the ball down the field. It's hard pressed for me to say that North Carolina is 10 points better than Virginia. So I do think there's going to be a lot of points scored. I think both these offenses should be able to put up some points, but I expect this to be another one that kind of comes down to the wire.
Greg Barnes, Inside Carolina. If Who's fans want to learn more about the Heels, where can they get more content from you and all the folks at Inside Carolina?
Well, InsideCarolina.com is our main site, but then also on Twitter, we're very active there. It's at Inside Carolina is the handle. We do play-by-play throughout the game. So if you're one of the people that likes to scroll Twitter while watching games, we try to add a lot of commentary there to make it a little bit more interesting.
Well, Greg, thanks so much for hopping on another week for me. Good news is none of the other local teams, Liberty doesn't play Carolina this year, so I don't have to bother you anymore. But I appreciate you hopping on for these 2 games this season, and thanks so much for joining us on this special edition of the Fast Lane.
Sure thing. Always a good time.
That will do it for this special edition of the Fast Lane. I'm Trey Lyle. As always, you can join the conversation at Fast Lane, Ed Lane, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and talk to me at Trey Lyle VT.